well. So with that, welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Lowe. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator at the Lewis Public Library, and thank you for joining us this evening for our Fireside Chat. This series was started, moderated, curated, and all those good things by our friend Paul Sparrow. Yay! Paul is a writer, historical consultant, and the former director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. Before moving to the library, he was the deputy director and senior vice president at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. He is also an Emmy award-winning documentary and television producer for Discovery, TLC, Fox, and PBS. And he is the author of an upcoming book just almost ready to launch any day now, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. And joining us this evening is James B. Conroy. He is an award-winning author and an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Having worked on Capitol Hill as a Senate press secretary and a congressman's chief of staff, and served for 6 years in the Naval Air Reserve, he graduated magna cum laude from the Georgetown University Law Center and practiced law in Boston until 2020. His first book, Our One Common Country, was a finalist for the prestigious Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. His second, Lincoln's White House, shared the Lincoln Prize and won the Abraham Lincoln Institute's annual book award. And he and his wife, Lynn, divide their time between Hingham, Massachusetts, and Martha's Vineyard. So welcome, gentlemen. The floor is yours.
Lincoln's White House is a fabulous book, but I have to ask you, what made you shift from the Civil War to World War II? Not that Roosevelt isn't better than Lincoln, but I mean, seriously.
Well, is this now working? It is, okay. Well, as I always like to say, I wrote 2 books about Lincoln to start off, and then I wrote Lincoln's White House, and then I wrote Jefferson's White House. And I wasn't smart enough to come up with another idea in that period. So I was watching a documentary on TV about the Casablanca Conference. And when I just saw the roster of personalities that were surrounded by barbed wire for 10 days in Casablanca, I thought there's got to be a story there. And in fact, there was. So that's how that came about.
Well, it's a great story, and you do a fabulous job here. And one of the great tools of writers is that you have to have great characters. And, you know, this is sort of a wonderful portrait of the group, which we'll go through individually in a second. But set the scene for us, because January of 1943 is a very complicated time. And what's going on in the world as they decide they're going to have this secret meeting in Morocco?
Well, we had these 2 maps made for the book. And the one word that I would choose to describe them both is terrifying. I don't think most of us understand how completely dominant the Axis powers were in January of 1943. But if you look at the Asian map on the right, Pacific Theater, I should say, in black you see Japan, and Korea. All of Korea was part of Japan at the time. They had annexed it long before, and also Taiwan. But all of those dark gray areas were under Japanese control, and the entire Western Pacific was under Japanese control. They had taken the Dutch East Indies from the Dutch, French Indochina from the French, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore from the British, and a couple of the Aleutian Islands from the United States. So completely in control of that area of the world. And if you look over at the European theater, you've got the 2 Axis powers in black, the German Reich and Italy. Germany was about half again as big then as it is now because of all they'd conquered and annexed into Germany. The dark gray countries are the ones that they had conquered and occupied. And the light gray countries, technically neutral, every one of them was either pro-German or, you know, with a German, pro-German bias one way or another. Swedes were providing them with iron. You know, the Portuguese and the Spanish were fascists. So the long and the short of it is, Not a single American bullet had been fired in Europe yet, by the way, in January of 1943. Not a single American bomb had been dropped on Germany. This was a British war from June of 1940 when the French went under. And as one of the generals we'll talk about said, they had hung on by their eyelashes up until now. So the conference was called to come up with an offensive strategy now. How are we going to attack and start to dismantle this enormous Axis power that we have to go up against?
And what this map doesn't accurately show is that the Nazis also controlled a large swath of North Africa. And Rommel was on the move, and they had sort of pushed the British army back, and there was a real threat that they were going to take over Jerusalem, in which case they had a deal, and they were going to massacre all the Jews in Jerusalem. So the stakes were high. So the conference, the invasion of North Africa happened in November of 1942, and then they wanted to try to get the Allies together, but
yeah, Stalin was not present. He was invited, but he had a pretty good excuse since the Battle of Stalingrad was going full bore at that time, and he and all of his generals had their hands full with that, so he was not present.
But he had a very strong demand for Churchill and Roosevelt, which was start a second front in Europe. You must come to our aid. America was providing them weapons and materiel through Lend-Lease, but Stalin really wanted a second front in Europe. So he was putting tremendous pressure for the Allies to invade France.
Correct. So I don't need to introduce this gentleman. This is, I think, the most famous photograph ever done of Churchill. There's a numerous little story associated with that. It was done in Canada, and there was a young Canadian photographer who was asked to take a formal portrait of Churchill. So he set up his cameras and his lights and his tripod and all. And Churchill was holding a big cigar with a big smile on his face, which was not the look that this young photographer wanted. So he walked from behind the tripod and snatched the cigar out of Churchill's hand, and that's the look that he got as a result.
It was a look that Churchill often wore when things didn't go his way. And then this is the other dominant character.
Yeah, if I may just go back 1 second on Churchill. The main thing to keep in mind about Churchill, I think, for this purpose, is that he was steeped in military affairs from a very, very young age. He went to Sandhurst, the West Point of the UK, was in the British Army for years, fought in 3 different wars, including the last cavalry charge in British history. And since then had written dozens of books of military history, was First Sea Lord in World War I and Secretary of State for War, really, really knew his stuff when it came to the military. FDR was nowhere near that level of military expertise.
He had also been in exile for a number of years because he alienated both his own party and the opposing Labour Party in Great Britain, and he was not brought back into the government until Germany invaded Poland. And then when they invade France, Chamberlain gets kicked out and he becomes prime minister.
So FDR, this picture was taken around the time of the Casablanca Conference. He was not yet gravely ill, as he became not that long thereafter. So he was kind of at the peak of his powers at this point. And again, not terribly well versed in military affairs until 1939 when he boned up and learned. But he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy and had held that job. He'd never worn a uniform, but had not made strategy as Assistant Secretary of the Navy either. So he was way behind Churchill when it came to military expertise, but way ahead of him when it came to political instincts. There was no better politician, no better judge of people, charming, charismatic guy. He could talk a dog off a meat wagon and just really had that kind of skill that was a real asset for the Americans at the conference.
Just to come to my boy's defense, he had studied naval history since the time he was 8 years old. He had over 4,000 books on naval history, including 72 on John Paul Jones, but we'll go on from there.
Well, no, one thing, let me add one thing. We'll come to George Marshall in a moment, but George Marshall at one point asked FDR if he would please stop calling the Navy us and the Army them.
True story. The luckiest movie ever released.
FDR had a dinner party at the White House the night before he left for Casablanca, which was very secret. Nobody knew he was going. And just a typical FDR planting this kind of joke that wouldn't be even understood for weeks to come. They showed the new movie Casablanca at this dinner party, which came out just as the Casablanca Conference was convening. So it's kind of an interesting coincidence.
And at that moment, there were probably only 1 in 100,000 Americans who knew where Casablanca was. It was not, as shall we say today, as well known as it is today. Now here's his, perhaps one of the most important military advisors that Roosevelt had.
Yeah, this is General George C. Marshall. Now everybody, probably in this room, everybody knows about the Marshall Plan, which was launched after the war as when Marshall was Truman's Secretary of State, for the recovery and rebuilding of Europe. But long before that, Marshall was the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the highest ranking officer in the Army. And I love these pictures because as the cliche goes, they tell 1,000 words, You look at that face and you see the strength of character of George C. Marshall. All of his top aides, wrote afterward that nobody ever got close to familiarity with George Catlett Marshall, just a stern, commanding figure. One of Truman's other Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said long afterward that George Marshall's very presence in a room was a striking and communicated force. The moment he walked in, everybody knew who was in charge. So that's the kind of guy you're dealing with George Marshall.
And FDR had this habit of doing these sort of informal drinking sessions he called Children's Hour. And he would get his sort of a closest aides together. And the idea was you wouldn't talk shop. You have to just drink and gossip about movie Hollywood or what was going on in Washington. Marshall never participated. He never crossed the line into trying to be part of FDR's inner social circle. He was the chief of staff, and that was his role, and he never broke that front. And one of the few to really not try to get into that inner circle.
Yeah, I've got a quote from him in the book after the war he was interviewed. He said, never got close to FDR, made a point of never laughing at his jokes.
Which irked him to no end.
I love this picture. This is taken of Marshall and one of his proteges, Eisenhower, who was also at the conference in a subordinate role. But again, it tells you a lot about the character of these guys. Eisenhower looks like he's running for mayor, and Marshall looks like his dog just died. So that gives you a sense of the personalities of the two men.
Marshall had helped select Eisenhower as the Supreme Commander for Torch, the operation that was the invasion of North Africa. And Eisenhower was not liked by the British, particularly, at least initially, because he had no real combat experience. He was a logistical guy. And the British really sort of looked down their noses at him. They looked down their noses at all the Americans. But this was the relationship that was critical to the American success later on, because, of course, when it came to select the Supreme Commander for the invasion of Normandy, everyone thought it was going to be Marshall, but in fact, FDR chose Eisenhower. So this photograph sort of is dramatic foreshadowing.
So here we have the Chief of Naval Operations, United States Navy, the most senior officer in the Navy, from Pearl Harbor, from before Pearl Harbor, all the way through the end of the war. And as I say in the book, probably nobody, how many people in this room have ever heard of Ernest J. King? Maybe half a dozen. And this is the guy who really won, at the top level, strategically won the war in the Pacific. As I say in the book, the United States Navy was blessed and cursed by the leadership of Admiral King throughout World War II. Blessed because there was no better, more brilliant strategic naval strategist than Ernie King, and he really masterminded the whole thing. Cursed because there was no more miserable human being on the face of the earth than Ernie King. Petty beyond belief, difficult for the fun of it, hated the British, did everything he could to bite them every time he got the chance. At one point, Eisenhower writes in his diary, one way we could help win this war is to get somebody to shoot King. So that gives you a sense of who the Brits are up against in the body of Ernie King.
And Ernie wasn't particularly happy at this point because the Navy was essentially being used as an Uber service for the Army to get the soldiers to North Africa. Once they landed, there wasn't much for the Navy to do. And to go to his team, you have to remember, you had people like Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Halsey, another set of really extraordinary leaders who were in the field. And then you had Admiral Leahy, who eventually becomes FDR's chief of staff. So the Navy was very, very well represented. In some ways had a closer tie to FDR than the Army did in terms of sort of emotional commitment.
Well, here we have the chief of the American Air Force. There was no separate Air Force at this time. It was part of the Army, but General Henry Arnold, known as Hap Arnold, and I think again the portrait tells you something about that, was the head of the U.S. Army Air Forces at the time. Another Marshall protege who built the American Air Force in the 30s from very little to a real world-class Air Force before the war began even, and went on from there. So he was really almost the father of the American Air Force.
And for those of you who are at either the Masters of the Air program or the one we did with Don Miller, as James was saying, the 8th Air Force was only just arriving in England at this point. And they had to split it off in two to create the 15th Air Force to help support this invasion and the battle for North Africa. And it was quite contentious about what the U.S. Air Force should do, particularly in regards to what the British Air Force should do, the Royal Air Force. They had very different strategies. So Arnold was always in a position of being squeezed on both sides. He didn't really control his own unit. He was under the Army, but he was expected to do these sort of miraculous things. And they had a very inexperienced, team of pilots, many of whom had never been in a plane before they were assigned to be B-17 pilots.
This is Hap Arnold when he was a brand new lieutenant. He was one of 5 aviators in the entire American Army, and had not been able to get into the ordnance school, wasn't smart enough. Nobody ever accused Arnold of being a genius, except when it came to air strategy. He was not known for being brilliant, but he went into the aviation field and asked if he could do it, and was told if he wanted to commit suicide, go ahead. By the end of the 2 years following that, there were 24 aviators in the Army. 18 of them crashed and died. Just, no war, just trying to fly these bicycles with wings. And as I always say, if Hap Arnold ever wanted a drop-dead line about his credentials as a military aviator, the Wright brothers had taught him to fly.
He was also a big supporter of Charles Lindbergh. And when Lindbergh was visiting the Nazi aviation plants, he would report back through the military attaché in the American Embassy in Berlin to Arnold. And when he came to the United States, before he made his first big speech attacking FDR's policy, he sent a copy of the speech to Arnold. And they offered Lindbergh a position as the Secretary of the Air Force if he would not give the speech. So.
Okay, so now we come to the Brits. And before we go one by one, if I may, I'd like to just basically tell you a little bit about the dynamic between the two sides. First of all, much more foreign countries than Britain and the United States are today. Keep in mind, there was obviously no internet. There was no radio, held in common. There was no television. There was no commercial air travel to speak of between the United States and Britain. Didn't read the same magazines, newspapers, whatever. So they were really very distinct countries, more even now than they are now. Secondly, the British had 300 years as a world power under their belts, and had been in command, in that role for 3 centuries. the Americans had been isolated between the two wars, had very little exposure to world affairs or international diplomacy or military strategy. And all of that said, the British really did, not only did the British look down their noses at the Americans, but the Americans looked up at the British. I mean, both sides were very much aware of the imbalance of power and maturity and sophistication. It's really, it's hard for us even to fathom now how imbalanced that relationship was in their favor at the time.
And the strategy was that they knew they could not win the war without the Americans getting involved, and they had to bring them in. So they were constantly dancing around saying, "You're stupid," and, "Oh yes, that's a lovely idea. We'll take it under consideration," because they knew that America's industrial might is what would win the war. And so they were constantly they can't offend them too much, but we have to let them know that they're idiots.
Yeah, Marshall was interviewed many times after the war, but one of the things he said is, we were always suspicious of the British. We always thought they were trying to pull something over on us, and the British could tell that. They knew that. So it was a little tricky, but he said they were never suspicious of us. They didn't think we were smart enough to be treacherous. So all of that said, this then is General Sir Alan Brooke, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff of the British Army and the most senior officer in the British military. Absolutely brilliant guy, world-class strategist, fluent in English, French, and German, competent in Urdu and Farsi. I don't even know what Urdu is, but that's the kind of sophistication he had. He had been the primary British leader at Dunkirk, by the way. Everybody knows about the British Army getting lifted off the beach at Dunkirk, but nobody thinks about how they got there. And when the Germans came pouring out of Belgium, they were in the middle of northern France and had to fight their way 40 miles through surrounding German army to Dunkirk. And Brooks the guy that got them there. So he's no armchair general. He was the leader of the British delegation, a very tough character, difficult, commanding figure, who indeed looked down his nose at the Americans, and there was a little tension involved in that too. This, though, is the other side of Brooke. Brooke had young children and loved to draw these cartoon characters for them. He wrote beautifully illustrated letters to his mother. He was a world-class ornithologist, big-time bird photographer, nature lover, and all the rest. So when you read his diary, which is fascinating, you got on the one hand this tough as nails military commander, and on the other hand, a guy with some real sensitivities and some artistic feelings and deeply into nature.
During some of the most contentious meetings at Casablanca, when he would get quite upset, he would go out and walk on the beach and walk through the Moroccan countryside to look at the birds. And who was it that accompanied him? There was
Kennedy.
Right. And so that was his escape. Sort of just imagine him walking down the beach in Henlopen, looking at the seagulls, because that's what he did.
So here's Brooke with Churchill on a British warship off the coast of Normandy right after the invasion, a day or two after the invasion. He and Churchill had a very contentious relationship. Mutual respect, they liked each other, they respected each other, but they went straight at each other every day, every single day. Churchill met with his high command and argued everything out, and Brooke wouldn't give an inch and Churchill wouldn't give an inch. It was really quite something to see. Just before the invasion, Churchill was insisting on going with the invasion force across the channel in the lead ship, okay? And nobody was senior enough to tell him no, except one person. He got a letter right before the invasion from the secretary to the king. And the secretary said that His Majesty's anxieties on D-Day would be much increased if he knew that his prime minister was on the bottom of the English Channel. And that's what dissuaded Churchill from going.
Actually, there were two letters, because Churchill initially still insisted on going, and the king had to send him a second letter saying that, well, if you're going to go, then I'm going to have to go too. And that's what finally got Churchill to agree not to go.
This is the first Sea Lord of the British Navy, Admiral Dudley Pound, whose father was a British barrister. His mother was a Bostonian from a long line of seafarers. Many of these Brits had British, English, rather American mothers or wives or whatever, including Churchill had an American mother, of course. Pound was an elderly guy. He had joined the British Navy in 1880 at the age of 14 and had spent his entire life there and was said to know every port in the world on a first name basis. Also a very genial, likable guy. The Americans liked him, but also had combative times with Churchill, and it was said about him that Dudley Pound feared neither God nor man nor Winston Churchill.
And for the British, their main strategic initiative about wanting to take North Africa was they wanted to get control of the Mediterranean. Because with Italy sort of jutting out and being a Nazi stronghold, the flow of goods and oil particularly was threatened constantly by the German Air Force and the German and Italian Navy. So getting control of the Mediterranean was really their driving force, which is why after North Africa, they wanted to go into Sicily and Italy, whereas the Americans wanted to just cross the channel and attack France.
That's the admiral on the bridge of a warship. I already used my funny line on that. So. Okay, so this is the chief of the RAF at the time.
I love this guy.
Yeah, the Americans, as a rule, were very fond of Charles Portal, who was the head of the Royal Air Force at the time, and you know, a real aristocrat, born to a landed gentry kind of family. Went to Winchester and Oxford. You know, very polished English gentleman, but never condescended to the Americans. Always treated them as equals. They trusted him. They could tell that he was a good square shooter, and he had a good level of trust with the Americans that helped a lot at the Casablanca Conference.
Yeah, he was one of the good guys from the American point of view.
Here he is at the battle during the Battle of Britain, talking to ordinary RAF pilots. The average age of which, by the way, was 20. Okay, and you look at some of these kids were 18, 19 years old. And there were only 3,000 of them fighting the entire German Air Force. And it was them, of course, that Churchill said never was so much owed by so many to so few. So the RAF had a real panache to it. You know, everybody respected what they had pulled off. So many of us are familiar with Lord Louis Mountbatten. I don't know if I can do it from memory now. Let's see, let's see, Louis, Francis, Albert, Victor, George, Nicholas Mountbatten. 5 names. Only in the upper class of Britain would he be called Dickie, but he was none of his names are being Richard. But he was Dickie Mountbatten was a very charming, personable guy. The Americans liked him too. You can see that again on his face. Very, very anti-class distinction. You know, the lowest ranking American at Casablanca, you know, would run into him. He'd chat. He's very friendly, very personable guy. He was in command of the British commando forces and all the kind of mixed missions, special forces operations. And he played a significant role at Casablanca.
He was brilliant and crazy. He was the one who came up with the idea of using an iceberg for aircraft carrier, right?
Yeah, well, it was one of his long-haired scientists, as they were called, had come up with all these crazy ideas. Some of them worked and were good ideas, but one was to build aircraft carriers out of ice mixed with sawdust. So if a torpedo hit it, you just pour more liquid sawdust and water in it, and you're done. And they did a model of it, and it actually worked. They actually tried it out. It actually worked, but it turned out to be too expensive and too impractical to use. But that's the kind of stuff he came up with, his group.
I can't remember whether this was at Casablanca or somewhere else, but at some point he's demonstrating this, and he takes out a pistol and he shoots the ice model of the aircraft carrier, and the staff outside the door thought, oh my God, they're shooting at each other, meaning the Americans and the British.
The bullet ricocheted off the ice and started bouncing around the room and went through the pant leg of Admiral King. So that was not such a good thing.
This is a great location that they chose. So again, for FDR to get to Casablanca secretly was one of the most extraordinary journeys. He left Washington on a train heading north, and secretly turned around, went south to Miami, and then went through Brazil and flew across the Atlantic to Africa, then came up the coast of Africa. First American president to ever fly while in office. First American president to visit a active battle zone overseas. First American president to visit Africa. It was sort of this incredible thing, but what he enjoyed the most was that he completely hoodwinked the press. They had no idea where he was.
So this is the venue of the conference in Casablanca. It was in a wealthy enclave on the far end of Casablanca. This was a luxury hotel called the Anfa Hotel in the shape of a steamboat. And the conference was held in the bow of the steamboat on that first deck. It was commandeered by the Americans when they took over North Africa, when they took Morocco. Patton was in command of that invasion force and commandeered not only the hotel, but this series of very fancy villas in its vicinity. If we could get the next slide. This is an aerial view. You could see the hotel under the wing. And then around it are half a dozen of these very luxurious villas that were privately owned by wealthy Europeans and Moroccans. And Patton took all of that as well. This is a plot plan I found among the papers of one of the officers there. And you can see the red barbed wire all the way around the hotel and the villas. There was a mile of barbed wire, anti-aircraft guns, tanks, fighter planes circling day and night overhead, elite American troops, British Marines, like a little fort. Of course, everybody knew something was up. There was something going on there. I got to tell this story, if I may, quickly. But they didn't know what. And there all kinds of rumors. But even the wildest of the rumors, no one would have thought that Churchill, FDR, and their combined high command was going to meet in this hotel. The neighborhood had been bombed by the Luftwaffe 2 weeks before that conference. And had they known who was there, they could have decapitated the entire leadership of the Allies. There was one spy in the employ of the Germans, a Spanish spy, who wrote a telegram to Berlin saying that Churchill and FDR were meeting in Casablanca in Spanish. And there's some poor German officer on the other side translated Casablanca as White House. So the Germans thought that they were meeting in Washington. What became of that officer, I don't know, but I wouldn't want to have been in his. Patton was also there, as you can see in the back seat of the Jeep being driven around with FDR. His diary is full of Patton-esque humor and rough edge, and it contributes a certain touch to the book. This is the villa that was assigned to FDR at the conference. Churchill immediately called it the White House, which everybody picked up, and it was the White House for the rest of the conference. Really beautiful kind of Art Deco, 1930s kind of fancy mansion.
Now, when you're the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of England, you have certain advantages on things that you can do, including asking your sons to join you.
Yeah, to the left there, on the far left, is Elliott Roosevelt, who was an American reconnaissance photographer in North Africa. Next to him is Harry Hopkins, who was FDR's right-hand guy. At the end of the table is Franklin Jr., who was a naval officer and had actually fought in the battle taking Casablanca and was decorated for saving the life of one of his crewmen. To the other side of him is a reserve officer who had formerly been a big AP reporter. FDR had known him for years. And of course, Roosevelt sitting on the patio of that Moroccan villa during the conference.
Harry Hopkins' son also came to the conference. He was a photographer, and Winston Churchill's son, what's his name again? Randolph also came to the conference. So and this was an opportunity for them to have family members there, but it was particularly important for FDR because in a wheelchair with his problems caused by polio, he needed very personal care, going to the bathroom, getting dressed, all these things that required someone that he could intimately trust. And so his sons would often play this role at these conferences. So they weren't just there as a way to get out of fighting, they were critical to his ability to function in these high-level conferences.
This is too emblematic, I think, of the difference between then and now with regard to who fought the wars, because everybody fought World War II. High, low, medium, everybody. Wealthy, poor. Both of those guys were decorated. They had another brother who was a commando in the Pacific, and a fourth who was another naval officer. So they were all in the war, and that I think is significant too.
Elliot, the guy on the left here, flew reconnaissance mosquito bombers, which are these very lightweight, basically wooden planes that were very fast. They would strip everything out of the plane, no guns, no nothing, and he would fly over German positions in the continent and back across the Mediterranean to North Africa to see what the German positions were. So very dangerous job.
This is Harold Macmillan. I suspect most of us remember Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister of Britain in the late 50s and into the early 60s, overlapped with Eisenhower and de Gaulle and Kennedy later. But Macmillan was a young diplomat, relatively young diplomat at the time at Casablanca. Very funny, charming guy, another aristocrat, Eton and Oxford, scion of the Macmillan Publishing Company. And he says at one point that he went to FDR's villa at night on his first day there and was astonished that this searchlight was thrown on him, and what he called what looked like retired Chicago gangsters leveled the most terrifying weapons he'd ever seen at him, and finally he was identified and he was allowed in. I thought that was a little harsh about the gangsters, but this is the...
Here they are. The United States Secret Service.
So I think Macmillan can be forgiven for that characterization.
That's Mike Riley, who was one of FDR's primary Secret Service agents and traveled with him extensively. And he was a no-nonsense person. He wrote a memoir of sorts, which is hilarious in its, shall we say, innocent honesty.
This is General Ira Aker, who was the American commander of the 8th Air Force in England. And again, they had just begun to build up there. They really weren't doing too much. By this point, they were, I shouldn't say not doing too much. They were bombing Dutch and French military targets, occupied Holland and France, but they were not yet bombing Germany, and they really had not yet built up to the massive force they later became. It was Eker who was, this is a long story, I'm gonna make it very short. The Americans were bombing by day. Their planes were designed for day bombing, a very state-of-the-art bomb site. They had like 12 heavy machine guns all around these flying fortresses and other bombers, and they were designed to fly by day with as accurate as it got in those days, bombing. The British were bombing only at night. They were not built for that. They had lost too many pilots bombing by day, and so they were only bombing by night. And Churchill wanted the Americans to join them in that, bombing German cities and factories by night, and the Americans didn't want to do that. So Eker was nominated to go talk Churchill out of this at the conference. Eker was the son of a Texas sharecropper being sent in to persuade Winston Churchill to abandon a very important strategic position, and succeeded. And the key to it was, he said to Churchill, you know, if you bomb by night and we bomb by day, they'll never get to bed. They'll be up all the time. They won't know when and where we're coming. We'll wear them down. They won't know which end is up. And Churchill kind of takes the cigar out of his mouth and says, I like it. The devils will get no rest. And that's where the title of the book.
Make a great title for a book, wouldn't it? So can you feel the testosterone on in this picture?
I mean, you got to figure that, oh, these are the Americans on the left side and the British on the right side. And these are the greatest five-star egos in the Western world, all sitting opposite each other. None of these guys are used to being told that they're wrong. And there was a lot of telling them each other that they were wrong for these 10 days. Brooke, for one, was famous for being in conference with other British officers and having a disagreement on some big strategic point, and he would say, "I flatly disagree," while snapping a pencil in half. So, and then you got Ernie King on the other side of him, who was just miserable with them. So there was a lot of that. They were generally polite and civil. There's 800 pages of minutes that I went through of these meetings. And they're generally polite, but there were moments when they lost their tempers, and when a recess had to be called. The other point that I like to make here, if you go down to the end of the table on the left, right after General Arnold, the fourth one in and the fifth one in, are an American brigadier general and a British brigadier general whose jobs were to take notes and write the minutes overnight. So you got brigadier generals doing this job of taking notes and writing minutes overnight. So they didn't have much sleep or much chance to do anything else. Vivian Dykes, who was the British brigadier, the second from the end there on the left, wrote a little poem about this, which I love. And so when the great ones repair to their dinner, the secretary stays, getting thinner and thinner, racking his brain to record and report what he thinks they will think they ought to have thought.
That sums it up beautifully. A quick back step, though. Many of you probably already know this, but when the British first came to the United States after Pearl Harbor and they started developing these strategies, the Americans wanted to go in to invade France, and the British were saying, like, you're not ready for this. So there had been an ongoing battle over 3 different conferences before they finally decided that they were going to invade North Africa, and only because Roosevelt overruled his own generals, Marshall and King, and said, no, we're going to go with the British plan and invade North Africa. So even coming into this, the American generals felt that they had not had their say, that this was not what they wanted to do, and they were unprepared. In this case, the British were much better prepared than they were.
Vastly. The British had brought well, let me start by saying the Americans had brought 7 officers, including the chiefs of staff. The British had brought 70. They also had a headquarters ship in the harbor, fully equipped with, radar and radio, and also stocked with all the white papers and studies that the War Office had ever done. Vastly overprepared compared to our side, and vastly superior in every way, and basically outclassed the Americans, which the Americans won, or rather learned a lesson from, because that was the last time that ever happened. And there were a number of conferences afterward, but that's the lay of the land at the time.
Well, and as James said earlier, the British had been fighting this war for several years and understood how formidable a foe the Nazis were. The Americans, with their sort of innocent arrogance, like, oh, we can beat them, we're Americans, we can do anything. And of course, they quickly found out that fighting the Germans was a lot harder than they thought it was going to be.
There's one remark that Brooke writes in his diary, that Marshall says they just want to cross the channel and you go right to Berlin. And he says, well, where are we going to go when we land, in Normandy? And he said he hadn't thought about that yet. So Brooke says it was unknown whether we were going to play roulette in Paris or by bathe in the Seine. That's the way he put it. So back to these 2 maps. This is to illustrate the big issues that were at that table and how they were resolved. On the Pacific end, it was an American war. The British had lost all those possessions and heavy ships and the rest, but they had their hands full in Europe. The Germans were 20 miles across the channel, and the Japanese were half a world away in the capable hands of the U.S. Navy. So the British were, wanted the minimal war, defensive war, in the Pacific until the European War was won. And the Americans wanted to go full bore at the Japanese for obvious reasons. And so that was issue 1. What proportion of our resources are we going to put in Europe, and what proportion in Asia? On the European side, As Paul noted, the British strategy was primarily to take this big Anglo-American army that was in North Africa at the time and use them in the Mediterranean, to take some target in the Mediterranean, yet to be picked, and hit the Germans in a place where they would be numerically weaker than the Allied force, because the Germans would know they were coming. There'd be the landing craft all lined up on the beach, but they wouldn't know where. It could have been anywhere, you know, in the Mediterranean. So they wouldn't be able to concentrate in any one place. And that was the British strategy. And then after they were weakened and, you know, had drawn forces from France and Russia to meet that invasion force in the Mediterranean, then we would cross the channel in 44, you know, after they had been bled and after they'd been weakened and after we had strengthened our forces and brought many, many more Americans over and many more weapons and the rest. The Americans just wanted to cross the channel like next week. Whether they were prepared or not, we just have to do that. That was sort of the American military doctrine. You hit the enemy as hard as you can, as soon as you can find them. You take the casualties, you give casualties, and eventually you wear them down and you win. And the British had been driven out of France with their tails between their legs, and out of Norway and Greece and everywhere else they'd fought the Germans, and they knew that this was not going to be a cakewalk. So those were the big issues to be decided at the conference.
Now, that American military philosophy actually dates back to the Civil War and Ulysses S. Grant, who eventually, when he be put in charge of the army by Lincoln, I think you know something about Lincoln, he just said, okay, well, we have more men than they do. If I lose 2 to 1 in every battle, I'm still going to win the war. And so that was, you know, literally a 19th century mindset, and the British had a more contemporary mindset. But to go to the suspicion that the British are trying to pull something over on the Americans was that Winston Churchill kept talking about, well, then we could go into the Balkans and we could go over here and any place other than France, which was partly because he wanted to try to preserve the British Empire and maintain access to the oil that was coming from the Middle East, and partly because he had served in World War I and he knew the horror of a ground war in Europe, and he was in many ways terrified of doing that. So that's the framework in which these two sides are meeting, and there was various agendas going on simultaneously.
So this is Sir John Grier Dill, a field marshal, the highest ranking officer in the British Army as a field marshal. He had been chief of the Imperial General Staff before Brooke and had not hit it off well with Churchill. He was a very cautious, careful, deliberate kind of guy, much unlike Churchill. And Churchill edged him out and placed him as chief of the British mission in Washington. So he had a very important role to liaise with the Americans in Washington, became very close to Marshall. Two of them became very close friends, trusted each other implicitly, would show each other stuff that neither was supposed to know from, you know, Marshall would show him secrets from the White House, and Dill would show him stuff that was coming out of London that they weren't supposed to know. They treated each other like brothers and were really close and trusted each other. And that was a crucial element in the conference. You needed somebody who was going to help bridge that gap.
Okay, we're running a little behind schedule, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Let's see. Let's talk about what actually happened at the conference, because I want to get to the king.
Okay, well, the upshot was that, and by the way, there were 20 different issues. There wasn't, the ones I told you were the big ones, but there were a bunch of smaller ones too. But the way they resolved it was a compromise that Dill had masterminded with another British officer. And it basically was that the Americans would have a free hand in the Pacific, but only with the forces that were already there. They wouldn't get any more than they already had. And if they had losses, they could replace them, but there would be no more weight, you know, given to the Pacific War, but the Americans could go as aggressively as they wanted to go. In Europe, the British plan was accepted, that they would go up through the Mediterranean. They chose Sicily as the target, which they did invade in June and took, and you know, then began on the boot of Italy and worked their way up the Italian boot. But the trade-off on that was that the British committed that they would cross the channel in spring of 44, and that everybody would be gearing up for that. The Americans would spend enormous resources on getting that ready and shipping troops and weapons and planes and everything across. And so the war in 43 would be basically in the Mediterranean, but then in mid-44, they'd cross the channel. And that was the way the war was won, basically.
Someday I'll do a program on the war in North Africa with El Alamein and Tobruk and all of the, Rommel, the Desert Rat, and Montgomery. It's fantastic, but it will take at least an hour. So this is a rather remarkable moment, and there's a whole series of photographs from this day, and FDR decided he wanted to review the troops, much to the chagrin of Mike Riley and the Secret Service and
George Marshall
and everyone who was there. And yet, describe this scene.
Yeah, well, this was the American forces getting ready to go into Tunisia to fight the Germans in Tunisia, and almost all of them had never been in combat other than a couple of days in Morocco when the French finally surrendered, but nobody knew he was coming. So they're expecting Mark Clark, who was the commander of that army, to do this review, and they're standing at attention, and along comes FDR in a Jeep. And Averell Harriman was there, former governor or future governor of New York, very close to FDR. And he said at first you could see their jaws drop, and then it was heartwarming to hear their cheers, that it really lifted their morale. And FDR, in addition to that, had letters written to all the wives and mothers and, everybody who were close to the guys that drove them and guarded them and served them and fed them and all of that, and also to about 1,300 Americans in a cemetery in North Africa under the white crosses, and sent that to all the parents as well. And at the FDR library, I found a file this thick of letters that came back, from all those people. And I used to read some of them, and I couldn't get through them, so I don't read them anymore, but they're really quite moving.
And many of the parents didn't know where their sons were. There was all secret. No one knew what any of this was going to go about. And this is, other than Lincoln's visit to Fredericksburg, this is the only time an American president has visited reviewed soldiers in an active war zone.
There he is having dining with Patton and Hopkins out of a mess kit, as Patton described it, al fresco. And FDR said at one point to Mark Clark he wanted to get his mess kit and bring it home as a souvenir. And they'd cleared the table, so Clark runs into the cook tent and he's told to just wash them all. There's thousands of them in the kitchen. So he just grabbed the nearest one and brought it back. And FDR said, "Oh, that's great. I'll have him put it in the Smithsonian." So.
It's at the library. It's at the FDR library. We didn't let the Smithsonian get that. So this is the picture I wanted to talk about, and we will have time for questions. Don't worry, because this is a moment, a dinner that really reflects the complexity of the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill, but more importantly, FDR's view of the post-war world. So talk about this. You do a fantastic job in the book describing this dinner.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, this is a dinner that FDR gave toward the end of the conference for the Sultan of Morocco, who's sitting at his right, a young guy in his 30s. The Sultan's son is standing behind him. The Sultan was said to be a devoted fan of General Patton, by the way, and said when he was Sultan, Patton would be his Grand Vizier, and they would go everywhere in a tank. But FDR wanted to make a personal connection to the colonial, Sultan of Morocco under French control. And at this dinner, you can see Churchill already looking terribly anxious. And at the dinner,
FDR had not just taken his cigar away from him either.
Yeah, right. Although he had served the dinner dry because it was a Muslim ruler. And Churchill writes on his program for the day where it said dinner with the Sultan. Churchill wrote dry, alas. And then he said, after dinner, recovery from the same. But at this dinner, Roosevelt just filled the Sultan's ear. 5 years from now, you'll be independent. We're going to send American engineers to help you build your infrastructure, get rid of the French. We're going to have no more colonies. Churchill's going berserk while he's sitting there hearing all of this. And he keeps trying to interrupt and change the subject, and FDR just bowls right through him. So you can see the look on Churchill's face. That was quite an interesting event.
A quick postscript: at the 50th anniversary of the Casablanca Conference, a group of Roosevelt family members and the director of the library and some other people went to Morocco to honor this 50th anniversary, and the little boy there was now the Sultan. And he was an absolute American advocate. He really believed in America. He remembered this meeting so clearly. He talked about it his whole life. And it was one of the reasons that Morocco was one of America's most staunch allies in this Muslim world, where, of course, politics were fraught. But a simple thing, Roosevelt apparently turned to the boy at one point and spoke to him through an interpreter. And the young boy never forgot it. And it just goes to show that diplomacy works on many levels. This is a great story.
Yeah, we'll do this quickly too, but well, first of all, there were 5 WACs, as they were called at the time, Women's Auxiliary Corps officers at the conference. They were all executive secretaries, and they were the first 5 WACs in the war zone in Europe. And they had been in London with Eisenhower and his staff, but then Eisenhower got moved into Algiers, and they had to move them too. And they thought it would be safer to put them on a British troop ship than to fly them. Well, the British troop ship got torpedoed in the Mediterranean in the middle of the night in December. And there were not enough lifeboats, Titanic type situation. 3 of them got into lifeboats, 2 of them didn't. And a British destroyer happened to come along. They got thrown from the deck of the sinking ship onto the deck of the British destroyer and wound up in Algeria. And then they were flown to be secretaries at Casablanca. And you can see them, they're the ones with the skirts, but you can see them with the clerical staff outside the Anfa Hotel. FDR heard about this and invited them all to dinner at his villa. So they all came to the dinner with Elliot. They thought they were being put on by Elliot. They didn't think this was really going to happen. They walk in, and there's FDR. In comes Churchill, Averell Harriman, General Alexander, the big British general, Harry Hopkins. All. So they spent like 3 hours having dinner and drinking and laughing and telling stories. And this woman kept a diary and interviews and articles, and I got it all from her daughter. I tracked down her daughter and got all this stuff. This is a photograph of her with Churchill, and she wrote underneath it, me and a buddy. So it's kind of a nice story.
Okay, Rebecca, we're going to go to questions. We only have a few quick shots. This is another great story, but we're running out of time. So who's this guy?
That's a guy by the name of Charles de Gaulle, 6'4", about a 6 mile four ego, made everybody else seem like a modest person. He was at Casablanca with his arm twisted to try to get him to cooperate with another French general, Henri Giraud, who had the same level ego as de Gaulle, referred to himself as the great General Giraud, without a hint of irony. And FDR, is too long a story, but FDR managed to connive them both into sitting with him before the photographers at the closing press conference. And if we have the next shot, had planted a thought FDR had through Hopkins in the eyes or in the ear of a photographer, an AP photographer. And the AP photographer stood up and said, "Oh, Mr. President, can we have a photograph of the 2 generals shaking hands?" So FDR puts his hands under their arms. They really had no choice, and they had the quickest handshake in human history, but it got on the front page of every newspaper in the Western world. So FDR had pulled off that coup.
They hated each other.
That's the press conference at the end. You can see Captain Anderson at the back in the top with her steno machine, the only woman president.
Yeah, this press conference was famous because FDR says that we were going to, the Allies will accept nothing but unconditional surrender. And he tells this long story about Ulysses S. Grant and unconditional surrender Grant. And it was something that the Allies had talked about, but Churchill had wanted to exclude Italy from that. But Roosevelt said, for the Axis powers, unconditional surrender, nothing else. And then he was partly talking to Stalin at this point. because they wanted to convince Stalin that they were in it for the long. All right, and then this is the two last slides we'll go through.
Last slides. After the conference ended, 10 days, 10-day conference, Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to go down to Marrakech with him. He loved Marrakech. He had painted down there in the 30s, and a little day of R&R. They went up on the minaret here, looking out at this view. The next slide. This is the painting that Churchill did from that minaret. He was really quite a pretty talented amateur painter. He had the painting shipped to FDR as a gift. Apparently, it wound up in the hands of Elliott Roosevelt after his death, who sold it, and ultimately wound up in the hands of Brad Pitt, who gave it to Angelina Jolie, who decided she didn't want it after the divorce and put it up at Christie's, where it brought $11.5 million.
And I think on that note, we will take questions. And a round of applause for James. Isn't he fantastic? Okay, I see a question in the back there. Keep your hand up.
Okay, yeah, we need to speak in the mic so our friends at home can hear us.
Yes. Okay. When you say FDR was the first president in a war zone, what about Lincoln visiting McClellan after Antietam? Does that not?
I think I said Lincoln was it Antietam or was it Fredericksburg?
Antietam. He was trying to goose him into following up.
Well, actually, when Lincoln was in a war zone was outside of Washington, at one of the forts defending Washington.
Yeah,
there was a raid on Washington. Yeah, and he stood on the parapets, and Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "Get down, you idiot!" and
one further, in convincing the Americans not to go into France too quickly, the British had the disaster of Dieppe behind them. And so they knew it wasn't going to be easy.
I saw a question over here.
Okay, hold on. Hold it close.
Field Marshal Montgomery, he wasn't involved in that?
he was fighting Rommel at the time in North Africa. But Alexander, who was his superior, was there, flew in combat shorts and shirts with sweat stains and unshaven right off the battlefield. So, yeah.
We have one over here.
Yeah, actually, a quick one from Zoom. How long did it take to research and write this book? Fascinating, is what they said.
2.5 years. Pretty much 7 days a week, as my wife will be able to tell you. But
yes,
this was a secret conference, right? So explain the strangeness of having a press conference when the conference just ended. How was that held tight?
Yeah, what they did is they flew 25 or so war correspondents in from Algiers, and they were all in uniform under military orders. It wasn't like free press, everything was censored. And they brought them in. They didn't know where they were going, why they were going, who was going to be there. And then when they assembled on that big lawn, out comes FDR and Churchill and de Gaulle and Giraud. So they were bowled over. It was quite an impressive thing.
Like I said earlier, FDR loved pulling the wool over the press's eyes. That was one of his great moments.
Hi, thank you very much. Great, very interesting. I came in a little bit late, and you may have mentioned this. Where were the Russians? The third part of the Grand Alliance.
Yeah, they were fighting the Battle of Stalingrad at the time. So Stalin had a good excuse. He was in Moscow.
Stalin would never leave Russia during the war for any of the conferences because he felt that if he left, he might not come back. We have another question over here. I thought I saw a hand. No, anybody over here? Well, it's only a few minutes after 6, so we did a pretty good job. Thank you all, and another round of applause for James. There will be a book signing over on the table there, and thank you all for coming.